an art school would want to engage with a commissioning agency and with a Kunsthal to profile a project like this, why we see this as important. I'm not going to exhaustively go into all the reasons, but I just want to look at one particular issue, which is the question of artists pursuing inquiries, artists conducting research, looking at questions, looking at the world, engaging in an interrogation of the world they're in. I'm going to try and do this in a not heavy art theory way, but in a more kind of accessible way, because I know not everybody is coming from a contemporary art kind of background. So this first quote that's on the screen there is from a recent essay by a curator called Alina Filipovic, and it's called The Global White Cube. And I just put it up as a marker of a particular fact. The fact that a particular cultural form, the gallery, the modern art gallery, the white box, very few windows, no natural light, suffused with diffuse lighting, and with objects kind of lifted up and put on display in a kind of sacred, very special aura kind of way, that this particular convention has become a global phenomenon, something that's as common as the format of supermarkets and airports around the world, the contemporary art gallery. And I'll come back to why that's significant in a moment. What I'm going to look at is the relationship between this idea of artists doing research and the question of the social turn. So I'm going to structure it like this. I'm getting very pedagogic today, forgive me. But I'll begin by what this social turn refers to. I'll talk a little bit about what this artistic research debate, and then I'll try and get to the urgency of why there needs to be a meeting here, why there needs to be a crossover here. And that will bring me to this slightly jargony term, political imaginary, but hopefully it'll make sense. So social turn is just a shorthand. It's just a handy term, not super precise, just a general term to point at something. And it points at a range of different developments that have been going on for many decades. And these developments are given different names in different countries. So in the US in the 1990s, we had the idea of new genre public art. In the US, the UK, and other parts of Europe in the 1960s and 70s, we had the idea of community art. And there's a whole range of other terms. What all of these things signal is a question about whether or not it's possible to change the operating terms of art, so that art, instead of being a luxury good or kind of experience economy, instead of it being a kind of a boutique kind of experience, that it actually becomes something that is distributed at many different kinds of sites, happens in many different parts of the world, of the social world, that it's also something that entails not the kind of the genius action of creation, but rather some form of co-working, co-production, participatory processes, whatever. Some form whereby the agency of the artist is not held out as a magical special thing, but rather as just another form of social operation, another thing that happens in the world, and that doesn't have to be mystified and covered by some kind of sacred talk. And how this social turn has been manifested is primarily not through debates, but actually through practices. There have been substantial debates and a lot of discussion, but I would argue that this tendency to try and shift art from the model of luxury good to some kind of agent or force or driver within the social world, that tendency is something that emerges again and again independently in lots of different places. So you see it in Brazil in the early 70s in the era of the dictators. You see it in Scandinavia emerging in the 60s and 70s in the context of the an issue we were looking at one of the earlier sessions, the revolution during office hours. We see it again and again emerging. It's a general tendency with multiple forms. There's lots of disagreements, lots of debates, but it's largely something that's emergent from practice that brings with it certain critical arguments. But the key thing is to see this as a practical undertaking rather than simply the production of an abstract critique of society. So some of the key themes that keep coming up in this social turn: the relationship between social processes and artistic processes, the potential for art to be a transformative, not in abstract, oh, we will be better human beings if we're exposed to the nourishment of culture, but in more concrete terms, that art having agency to affect actual concrete social, political, economic change. The specificity of art is a concern. The idea that there is something particular to art, but it's not necessarily the mysticism of the artist's genius and so forth. And there's also been a recurrent concern about the strategic institutional investments in these developments. So the way in which some of these initiatives for social transformation can be captured and steered to become something else, to become a kind of pacifying process to keep a citizenship inert, keep them calm and distracted and not mobilized. So often within this field of practice, there can be quite kind of stormy debates, and things can get quite acrimonious at times as people accuse each other and call each other names, neoliberalism being a kind of a big stick to hit people with. But it's starting to understand that we're talking about a field of diverse practice where there is internal contestation. It's not like we have one big happy family of people saying, let's do social engineering to artistic practice. It's a much more complex and diverse field. Other issues that come up are the nature of education for artists, so that they don't just see the luxury good model as the dominant and only available model. So some very quick examples. I'm just going to name check these rather than do any detail. Trampoline House, a current initiative in Copenhagen, the famous Park Fiction project in Hamburg from the mid-90s. In a very different mode, Jeremy Deller's The Battle of Orgreave were a community that includes the original miners and policemen who were active in this famous conflict from the miners' strike in the 1980s, are engaged in a reenactment. This project in Istanbul, Oda Projesi Room Project, where a bunch of artists set up a room within an apartment block and start to generate different layers of social life within the space. The famous Wachenklauser, a group often cited in these debates, and here a project where they, in the mid-90s, make an intervention in Zurich where they create a social space and resource for women using drugs. So with this production of a whole range of practices, I've given examples that are just from the 90s onwards, but I could go all the way back to something like prolet cult in the 1920s and argue that you find a continuous, recurrent emergence of attempts by artists to reposition the practice out of the luxury good model and into some other kind of dynamic or social agency. Grant Kester is one of the people who's been involved in commentating on these practices. And in a book he produced about 12 years ago, he proposed part of a kind of an articulation, a way of making sense of some of these practices, but he also proposed it as a critique of the kind of the luxury good model of art making. And he basically targets certain habits that have become kind of embedded in the contemporary art field. And he basically sees this as a general consensus that the artwork should in some way be, it's supposed to cause trouble. We expect artists to be difficult and to have strange opinions or to do strange things and to upset our habits of thought or challenge our conventional assumptions. But there's a sense that this model of the artist as the kind of enfant terrible or the revolutionary is in fact a kind of a mythic structure that sits very easily accommodated within a kind of boutique culture system. So it's like a performance of opposition that's very easily recouped as a saleable commodity. And Kester points to a couple of things that feature in these models, and just to note two of them. One, the idea that there's a kind of radical separation between speaking and sensing the world. That these are two radically different ways of being. So there's kind of a tendency to separate us out, to produce a kind of mind up here speaking away and a body down here eating away, and that they're kind of not really in the same integral complex. And the other one being that there's a tendency to assume that the question of the aesthetic, the question of that experience of a kind of a wow, a gee whiz, or a shock with the work is always about a kind of instantaneous thing. It's typically something that's individually experienced, and it's something that is fundamentally resistant to passing over into some kind of social collective discussion or reconstruction. That's the social turn. I just want very quickly to contrast that with another kind of development in the artistic field over the last 2-3 decades, and that's a debate about artists doing research. And this is just a small sampling of many publications that have appeared over the last 3 decades. So this artistic research debate has been developing since the 90s, and at the heart of it is the question, is it possible for artists to do research? Can artists contribute knowledge? Is there a way in which the artist can deliberately set about to find something out? And the debate has been conducted both through people enacting practices, doing things, making art, but it's also been conducted through a lot of this publication and so forth. So in this debate, some of the key themes that keep coming up are the relationship between the aesthetic and other kinds of processes, the divergence between art and science, the specificity of art, the institutional and strategic interests in framing art, and a big one is the question of doctoral education for artists, and that's a discussion that just goes on and on and on in a not especially interesting way, but just to give you a very quick sampling, super quick, this is a project that was completed here in Gothenburg by the artist Magnus Bartos, who's now professor in Konstfack, and just to give an example of what he did, he simply produced a portfolio of work, and within this portfolio of work he elaborated a particular idea about something he called the work story, and essentially this was a proposition about how an artwork acquires meaning or operates or functions or circulates. So basically making work and producing a proposition about how artworks operate. This is an example from Ireland, an artist called Conor McGarrigle, and for his project he was looking at how artists could work with location-based media, and one small part of that was this project here called Namaland, and essentially this involved the artist producing an app that could fit on any smartphone, and with this app, if you looked through it at any aspect of the built environment, this little Monopoly man would show up on the screen whenever the property you were looking at was an asset that was in this toxic bank called Nama, which was the single biggest real estate owner in the world on paper. This was the entity created to absorb all the bad debt created by the financial crisis in 2008. So this was public money financing a toxic bank, but the citizens who were paying the taxes and funding the bank were not allowed to know what properties were in this toxic bank. So the artist's intervention was through grabbing what information was available, he put it together and then made this app available so people could know which parts of the built environment were in fact part of this citizen-funded toxic bank. So this became a national news item because this artist had put something into the public domain which was effectively being made illegal. It was illegal for the taxpayer to know what the tax monies were paying for. This is a different kind of example of artists doing research. This is an 8-year project that's just coming to an end, initiated by the Basis for Actual Kunst in Utrecht. And this project involved a whole series of exhibitions, congresses, all kinds of residencies, sustained critical projects around the proposition that post-89, there isn't a former East, there's a former West, in the sense that the dominance of a particular model of Western modernity is thrown into crisis, and we need to rethink our geopolitical imaginary. This final example is the example initiated by another Dutch organization, the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, and this is a project to exhibit a Picasso painting from 1948 in Palestine. So sending the Picasso painting to Palestine, a 2.5-year project that basically in the process reveals the particularity of this convention of putting things on display in a white box when the outside of the white box becomes a colonized territory in the West Bank or in Gaza. What happens when you try to put an artwork on display there? All of these are actions of research conducted by artists and curators just doing the work that they do as an artist or a curator. Now, what I'm concerned about is the way in which these practices have been caught in debate. And in the debate, what has come up again and again is concerns about, okay, if we start talking about artists doing research, is that really art anymore? Where is the artist in this? This has also been a debate about resources and legitimacy. If artists can do research, well, then maybe they can apply for research funding, and there seems to be a lot of that available in the world, so maybe this is a way to access resources. But there's also a question of legitimacy, and maybe artists can be positioned to become kind of agents for leading how universities might develop or other kinds of knowledge bodies. But another one has been a kind of an attempt to contest for avant-garde status, to be the most radical, to be the most revolutionary. Now, my concern is that I think some of the things that are happening as actual research actions by artists and curators are much more interesting than some of the debate that's been conducted about what it is for an artist to do research. And what I think is wrong here is that within the debate on artists doing research, you have this constant regurgitating of the idea of art and artists and the specialness of art and the uniqueness of the artists, and you end up with the idea that art is a kind of natural kind, that there's fire, there's water, there's the sky, and there's art. It's a condition of existence that's fundamental, rather than an interesting and complex idea that was elaborated in Western Europe over the period from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment. A very interesting, complex, and in many ways worthwhile idea, but nonetheless a historically contingent idea, a production of history, an accident in some sense. To give you an illustration of what I mean by this, here I'm just taking this quote from a sister institution that will remain nameless, but I just want to give you an idea. So this is what artistic research does. It makes a twofold contribution. And the specific knowledge required to support and strengthen artistic practice, this is something that artists doing research, they give resources to make more art, and they mirror and are potentially driving a wider shift in research. And what I see is wrong in this is that you have a kind of a bubble world being created, a self-enclosed game of imagining that it can extend itself into other games. So art is the means of research, art is the object of research, and art is the outcome of research. It's just this kind of little closed bubble. And you have a lot of people spinning their wheels on, well, the artist is special. And when an artist does research, it's very different from when someone else does research, because artists are special, because that's what's special. And the fundamental thing about this is that this is this is not a process of inquiry. This rhetoric is a process of shoring up a very old idea of art, an idea that really crystallized in the early 19th century and played itself out over the 19th and early 20th century, and has been contested and reshaped in a myriad of different ways. One strong pattern of that reshaping is precisely this social turn, but that is precisely what is being refused in these rhetorics that are rehearsed around artistic research. So I'm emphasizing here, individual projects are conducted in a much more interesting and complicated way and deal in a much more inventive way with the question of what art can be and how it can operate. But this institutional rhetoric that's been elaborated by people like myself who are embedded in institutions like academies and so forth is tending to spin out a rhetoric that's shoring up essentially a romantic romantic modernism or something like that. It's an old idea. Now, I don't want to say we should not work in a white cube, and I don't want to say that we should never make luxury goods. I'm just proposing that we should not assume that those are the paradigm. Those are the only way or the most typical way to do art. Make something special, preferably not too much of it, and put it in a white room and hope someone will buy it. It's all very well. I do sincerely mean that it's fine to operate that way. It just should not be the paradigm. It should not be that's the real art, and then anything else that's not like that is kind of art manque. It's kind of art, but not really. Because if it was real art, we could put it in a room, we could show it to you, and you could have the chance to buy it. The urgency of a crossover between this social turn and this rhetoric, this question of artistic research, is that in very basic terms, the social turn opens up the question of what are the multiple ways in which art can be, what are the multiple ways in which artists can operate. It does not mean that it prescribes a single mode. It means that it diversifies. There's other ways of doing things. And the key thing that interests me, particularly when you look at a project like what Kerstin has done in PARK LEK, she arrives in a situation and starts to ask questions. And out of that process of asking questions, stuff starts to happen. Not in a particularly pre-formulated, highly structured way. There's a certain amount of emergence. Things emerge, are discovered. That is fundamentally an act of research, an act of inquiry. And what's going on here? What's happening? What could happen? What's possible? What do you see? What do I see? What other kind of situation does this situation potentially contain? That is inquiry, research, and that's, for me, an intrinsically interesting thing because it opens the possibility that the world can be other than it just immediately seems to be. That's the possibility that the world might be or become other than it currently appears to be. And that seems to me to be a fundamental condition of criticism, of living. A fundamental condition of living is the possibility that the world can be different than it currently appears to be. Because if it can, then perhaps we can have some agency in shaping what it can become. The social turn projects, and one of the things that I think you see in those pretty randomly selected examples that I started with, and one of the things that you see as a recurrent issue within the PARK LEK project is the question of we're living in segregated societies, increasingly segregated, not getting less segregated, getting more segregated, more polarized in terms of wealth and poverty. And we see that the themes of class and ethnicity and other forms of identity category that form the basis of social exclusion or political exclusion, they're become mobilized. They start to move in these situations, and they become palpable, and they pass over into discourse in a way that is not simply through the terms of the dominant media. So I'll jump a little bit here, but the key thing is that within these processes you have a direct engagement with the facts of segregation. And they engage with them in a way that doesn't promise any easy, super simple, elegant solutions, but rather in a way that just makes it something that cannot simply be dismissed as, oh, that's the intractable problem of the other. Oh, those others out there, there's a problem there, but what can you do? We just throw some money at it and hope for the best, or maybe a wider green space around the problem, we might be able to at least contain it. So instead of those strategies, we engage with the possibility that there might be other ways things can happen. Now, I'll finish on this point. The themes that are repeated again and again in these social turn projects, the things that come up again and again, questions of the idea of public, community, class, local democracy, local politics, agonistic political culture, the idea of a political culture that's not based on us trying to reach consensus, but based on the principle of difference and us looking to find different ways to be different together, that we can find ways to be in difference with each other, but not indifferent to each other. To inhabit difference as a constant problem that will never get easy, but it might be enlivening to engage it rather than deadening to accept a consensus which says that the real problem in life is to manage the economy. So instead of that deadening proposition to say the real possibility in life is that we could live otherwise, that we could be otherwise. These are themes that come up again and again within these projects, often ridiculously small projects with these huge, huge ideas, or often really huge projects based on quite a small idea. I'm thinking of the hospitality idea that was at work in the project in Copenhagen where it was simply the idea that people in Copenhagen would open their houses and give accommodation to people coming to visit the summit. That this opening of hospitality to many people is this very simple idea, but the actual practice of it has huge ramifications for people's sense of what is possible. And this is the point I would like to finish on, the question of the political imaginary. This idea of political imaginary is what we think is possible, what we think exists, and what we think is the horizon of possibility. So what kinds of things exist? So in a certain political imaginary, we have something like dangerous youths out in the suburbs. So in that political imaginary, we have, fortress cities surrounded by threatening enclaves who could get into the center and cause damage, so we have to push them out. So these political imaginaries are actually very old and very persistent. But what we see in these projects is the attempt to imagine differently. Why we might need to imagine differently, I would just hint at in terms of this image of three premier politicians at the funeral of another one and their engagement in the production of an image of themselves together. And it is the problem of our political imagination that we are held in thrall to this kind of endless proliferation of images. And this endless proliferation of images making images. And so the idea that what an artist might do is make a new image to insert and interrupt this circuit is less compelling given the saturation of images. And I kind of give this as an example of the failure of that strategy here when Ai tries to recreate the image of the dead child washed up on the shores of the Mediterranean, the Elan Kurdi. So when the artist tries to reconstruct this image, I think we have the poverty of our political imagination, the poverty of thinking that the available means and political hope that we can have is to produce and circulate another image, that is our agency. And that, to me, is the impoverishment of our political imagination, that we think the circulation of further images is what will, our ability to act. We'll put a story out about ourselves on Facebook, that's the way in which we will achieve social and political reality for others. So what I would propose is that a part of the significance of this social turn is that it represents a practical experiment in political imagination, in imagining what might be possible. The risks of a practical experiment in political imagination, the risks are obvious. There's the risks of utopianism, there's the risk of a kind of blind idealism, there's the risks of simply not making contact with contemporary conditions of possibility because you get lost inside a fantasy world. But the significant thing of practical experiments in political imagination is that the practicality of these experiments is precisely what stops them drifting off into just an unhooked, free-floating fantasy, because they get their hands dirty in this world while trying to imagine a better world. And I think this is really what is significant about the engagement with something as tricky and greasy and slippery as a local democratic process, an urban administration, whatever, getting in there with all its trickiness and having the politician try to co-opt the project because it might be good in an election moment, but not refusing that, simply hoping that one can maneuver with it, that one can dance with it and reposition the politician's bid to leverage your project as his electoral base, and that you can move that in a different way to maybe reposition the politician's understanding of what is possible within the machinery of local government. So this question of the political imaginary is the one that I would try and, it's the abstract proposition I would unhook from many of these examples. And I think the concrete thing is practical experimentation that has a bearing on political imagination. And this to me is more interesting than for 2 centuries now, European philosophers have been talking about the imagination of the artist. And it's a very dull and tired conversation. And I think we could risk for a generation that we'd shift the terms of the conversation and just look at the political imagination and not the specialness of the artist, not the narcissistic self-enclosure of the artist, which is fundamentally a limiting move. We move away from that limitation and we look at the possibility of getting entangled and dirty and messed up in this world. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mick. I know it's coffee time now, but there is time for one question or so. Yep.
Hi there. And that was all very interesting for me. I mean, I'm someone who works as an artist across the kind of luxury goods market in the context of academic research, and also in that kind of that space which you describe as the kind of social, as kind of embodying the social turn in terms of working in public art projects. I suppose I was just kind of interested as you were talking. And you were talking about the failure of kind of images, and I wasn't taking that too sort of specifically kind of literally in terms of an image, but I was thinking about it in terms of an idea of representation. So I was listening to what you were saying and hanging on to my own belief that the act of making representations is still a powerful kind of political kind of act and absolutely kind of necessary. So I was just wondering, I suppose, because I identified the fact that I work across these different spaces, as a way of wondering whether or not trying to articulate the solution as lying within this paradigm as opposed to that paradigm is in itself a kind of flaw. And I was thinking about a work such as Jeremy Deller's The Battle of Orgrave, which I personally really like. I think is a very successful work. And then the I Wee Wee image, which I think feels dreadful. And just kind of wondering about what the difference is really in terms of how we articulate and position those artists and those practices, and just sort of thinking whether or not categorizing them in that way, and just what your thoughts were when comparing something like the Battle of Orgrave as to my mind, as a successful political image that functions within the space of a social turn, but also then functioning as an image and as a representation of the I Wee Wee one just being, it doesn't work, it's bad, you know, it's bad art.
Well, I mean, I pretty much agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think my proposal really, I'm giving you a shorthand compressed thing, but what I'm getting at with the Ai Weiwei is that here is an image that's designed to circulate within the reputational economy of the art world. Its function is to build and boost the brand Ai Weiwei within this commercial art system. And it's significant that it takes a kind of politically charged image and tries to mobilize it. But what's happening in the mobilization of the image, the failure, I would say, is that it's simply being instrumentalized in the service of producing the brand Ai Weiwei. Yeah. Now, but what I'm trying to get is that is paradigmatic action of the artist as the kind of shock troop of our imagination. You know, the artist comes in and here I've got a bucket of blood, I'm going to throw it over you, or here I've got some horror to show you, or you know, here I'm pacing myself in the space of this the dead innocent. And I see that this idea of producing the shocking image for distribution within these circuits is a failed strategy. But the reason I'm targeting that strategy is because I believe that's the paradigmatic one for this debate on artistic research, particularly as it's being conducted in Scandinavia at the moment. This has been held out. That's what artists do. They shock you. And I'm trying to put... So I work in art education. I want to work with students who want to pursue all kinds of projects. I do not want to only prescribe social practice. That would, to me, would be awful. But what I am trying to do, though, is to point to a real closure that is being enacted within institutional discourses, where they're really shutting down the idea of the artist to what is the... It's never made explicit, it's always implicit, but it's the artist as the producer of a unique or short-run luxury good item. And the model for then survivability for the artist becomes selling those within a particularly limited kind of boutique system. And you just go, there's got to be multiple ways, even if what you want to do is produce a small number of images, there's got to be multiple ways you can do that and position that. It doesn't just have to be circulating within this very narrowly conceived system, which doesn't really even deliver the kind of livelihood that it promises for the most part. So it's just, that's but to be really clear, of course, I have no wish to prescribe an orthodoxy, this is the only way to do it. I'm really proposing an encounter. I think what would happen if the people proposing artistic research in this abstracted way were actually to look seriously at the claims being made by a variety of practices, rather than to lift it always up into a highly abstracted level about what an artist is. I mean, the most dull conversations that begin today with science does this and art does that. It's like it's something that should come from a child's storybook or something. It has no place anymore in a serious conversation, but it is precisely what is being reproduced and circulated at the moment.
Thank you.